I put this up because I really want any white person in the room to know up front that this is what we're dealing with, that it's not going to be this coddling of white tears and what that looks like. We're not going to discuss, oh, maybe some of us have worked it out. No, you're always going to be racist, actually. So even when you're on your path to trying to figure out how to be a better human being, because I believe that white people are born into not being human, like that actually, instead of people of color and black folks being dehumanized, that actually everyone is dehumanized off rip within white supremacy, that y'all are born into a life to not be human, and that's what y'all are taught to do, to be demons.
Give up on the whole YouTube and podcasting thing and become a critical race dominatrix. I mean, there's clearly an incentive for it. It's a no-brainer of a business plan. Don't look at me like that. Y'all just hate seeing a girl boss win. If there's anyone that deserves to get in on the white guilt grift, it's me. What's the point in having principles and morals when I can just do this? It's me, Angie, your critical race dominatrix, and this video is intended for white people who don't know how to behave. You are racist. You harbor unconscious biases in that deep, thick Caucasian skull of yours. Send reparations to my OnlyFans, and I'll make it my job to educate you. I also accept Dogecoin. So you say you don't understand critical race theory? Well, that's because you refuse to listen to the marginalized voices of sex worker Nubian goddesses like me. Taste the whip, Mayo bitch. I think the libs would eat this shit right up. It doesn't matter that it's cynical. It doesn't matter that it doesn't actually solve anything. All that matters is that it gives me a momentary sense of power and agency, while also allowing guilty white liberals to feel as if they're on the right side of history. I personally don't get off on the notion of race play, but obviously it's a more popular fetish than I once thought. But what about those of us who didn't consent to be part of this Freudian display of kink and feeling kinky about shame? Unfortunately, modern racial discourse has no safe word, and there is no opting out. Critical race theory and anti-racism are now becoming fixtures of the culture war-obsessed narratives that dominate the news cycles and torture the collective psyche with a sense of implied recrimination and guilt, but also a demoralizing sense that humanity will never be able to coexist for as long as we are incarnate on the planet. Everyone from bog-standard liberals to conservatives are weighing in their takes and heaping rhetorical gasoline onto the already raging dumpster fire, and unsurprisingly, the experts have crawled out of the woodwork to contribute to an air of intellectual mystification that makes it nearly impossible for a regular person to grasp a coherent opinion. I personally don't believe that this is a bug. I think it's a feature. The current mainstream approved dialogue about race is designed to make people feel confused, fraught, and alienated from the world and the people in their communities. Despite whatever the official narrative declares, you don't have to be a big brain politics otaku to grasp an intuitive understanding that when it comes to the modern paradigm of anti-racism, something is desperately wrong. The mainstream racial discourse carries with it an air of fear, besiegement, and it is designed to inspire moral fatigue, a conflict-avoidant response in some, misplaced feelings of rage and resentment in others, and full-blown kink submission arousal among guilty white liberals. Ooh, nothing gets me hotter than white submission. So, why exactly do I believe that this negative cycle is a feature and not a bug? Well, because critical race theory and anti-racism are currently being marketed to us as Adolph Rhyd articulately observed, a neoliberal alternative to class consciousness. one that seeks to undermine the traditional civil rights demands of integration, equality under the law, and economic access in favor of adopting a purely racialized paradigm that centers racism as the primary source of disparities in America. The dominant narrative is currently attempting to deter any serious and measured excavation of CRT, and curious individuals are subtly being coerced into deferring to official academic authorities, accepting received wisdom, and unquestionably adopting a racialized framework that will in coming decades have significant impacts on their workplaces, schools, policy outcomes, and social interactions. I don't buy the notion that regular people are too smooth-brained to understand the complexities of critical race theory, or that a desire to express concern about its cultural trends and social impacts is somehow always rooted in internalized racism or interrogated bigotry, as proponents of CRT often claim. This is insulting to the intelligence of the vast majority of people who are expressing concerns about critical race theory, not all of whom are white and/or hostile towards the general principle of anti-racism. So, what exactly is critical race theory? Where did it come from, and what purpose was it designed to serve? Depending on who you ask, critical race theory can be anything from a neo-Marxist plot to destroy America, to the very thing that's going to save it from impending destruction. But if you ask me, I believe it's a complete ontological overhaul that centers race as the primary form of analysis in every area of life. Critical race theory is a school of political theory that was developed by civil rights scholars like Derek Bell and Richard Delgado during the post-civil rights period of the 1970s. The civil rights movement of the 1960s won many major legal, political, and cultural concessions, including affirmative action laws and an end to Jim Crow and segregation. At this point in American history, it made sense to organize Black people as a class because of the political and material impacts of things like Jim Crow, which were specific and racialized laws designed to materially disenfranchise the Black population. The assassinations of prominent civil rights figures and the brutal subversion campaigns launched by the national security state fractured the movement and cast the political momentum adrift. So by the late 70s, the civil rights activists who survived the fault lines were now seeking new avenues to develop policy and political theory. Academia became a major frontier, especially for a newly forming post-civil rights Black academic elite who managed to gain footing within American institutions, but had mostly abandoned the economic populist and socialist leanings of the original movement. After Jim Crow was repealed, Black academics and intellectuals found themselves in a very weird spot. The laws that once gave them a common cause with the poor and working class Black people were no longer in effect, and major class contradictions emerged that threatened to unseat the position of intellectual authority they once had. The Black intellectual elite could not talk about race as anything other than a social construct, so they needed a new way of making race significant, one that allowed them to retain an ontological link to the rest of the Black population. This is when race became cultural, and these academics began viewing Blackness as a cultural/ontological phenomenon, imbuing it with an almost metaphysical significance. Of course, this then worked to successfully obscure the class contradictions by centering a trans-historical narrative of oppression as the primary avenue for achieving racial liberation. Proponents of CRT express hostility towards the notion of integration, and also reject the notion of race blindness, in favor of creating a world where race is given profound significance in every area of life. The overall goal of critical race theory is to create a race-based ontological shift within American institutions. And its premises are based upon a rejection of liberal Enlightenment ideals, which are viewed as inherently white principles. In his essay, Anti-Racism, a Neoliberal Alternative to the Left, Adolph Rhyd recalls his time at a conference at Harvard Law School in 1991. Legal theorist and critical race theory pioneer Derek Bell was the speaker, and he nonchalantly stated that blacks had made no progress since 1865. Rhyd was shocked by this assertion, particularly because Bell was a black American leading a conference at one of the most prestigious universities in America. But also, Rhyd realized that the content of this statement held a much more insidious subtext. It dawned on him that the discourse about race was evolving away from discussions about the causes of racial disparity and were beginning to draw conclusions purely from observations about the impacts of racial disparity. This radical shift in theoretical framing works to encourage a perception of racism as a purely ontological phenomenon instead of a materially inhibiting reality. When one is fixated on the idea of blackness versus whiteness as the primary antagonism in society, it naturally shifts into an ontological war between the forces of good versus evil. Blackness representing the virtue of the oppressed, and whiteness representing the source of all society's ills. Well, then there's nothing left to examine. No nuance is tolerated, and no view of progress is encouraged. Lest it undermine this incredibly convenient cover for underlying class antagonisms. In other words, it transforms the conversation about race into the plot of some weird, Marvel anime fucking YA fiction thing. And we all know how much the libs love that shit. Racism is not the Avada Kedavra curse from Harry Potter, you fucking nerds. Touch grass. It dawned on Adolph Rhyd that proponents of critical race theory were not actually interested in eliminating the conditions that cause disparity. They were more concerned with haphazard attempts to erase disparity. This over-focus on disparities relies on the premise that if racial disparities somehow disappeared, this would solve the economic and systemic issues that plague the black community. It is a kind of race reductionism that desires an equal division of exploitation, rather than a desire to get rid of the conditions that create exploitation for the working class altogether. In other words, it's perfectly fine that poor and working class black and white people don't have healthcare, because now there's an equal proportion of middle class black and white people who do. To me, this is an incredibly monstrous and terrifying notion, but it is an incredibly useful one to a capitalist system that is creating this sort of ideological reproduction in order to justify itself. Racial discrimination is in fact not the most prominent feature impairing black achievement in America today. It can be alarming to look at racial disparities on a surface level, but without proper contextualization of this information, people are being encouraged to jump to haphazard conclusions. The context behind these disparities is that Black Americans still make up a large percent of America's poor and working classes, and this entire class is collectively experiencing the brutal excesses of an ever-accelerating neoliberal colonization. Of course, racial inequality is made more evident by this phenomena, since Black Americans make up those on the tail end of this equation, due to their historical position as the most expendable labor force. But looking at racial discrimination as the sole contributor mystifies deeper dimensions and removes the universalist channels between the Black experience and the experience of the rest of the working class under capitalism. Not only will an over-focus on efforts to eliminate racial disparities through critical race theory not take us in the direction of a more equal society,
it isn't even the best way of eliminating racial disparity. Collective class struggle is. It is very common for anti-racist liberals and leftists to express outright disdain for the white working class and even condemn them as an inherently reactionary force in society. However, it is practically impossible to imagine a strategy for winning the kinds of reforms that would actually help improve the conditions for minorities without winning them for all working class people. The only way this can be achieved is through broad working class solidarity, which CRT actively discourages. Recently, General Mark Milley, the US government's highest-ranking military officer, spoke out against the amorphous threat of white rage when addressing the January 6 riots and the teaching of CRT in major US institutions. His statement obviously drew a lot of attention because of the pejorative nature of the term white rage and how this term distracts the public by posing an all-encompassing explanation for forces far more complex than the ascriptive categories the rioters belong to. It is no surprise that the US national security state has taken on this ideology as an extension of its endless profiteering from manufactured threats. We are beginning to see an impending racial strife occupying the same space as the war on terror abroad once did. The current Biden administration has declared a domestic war on terror, which identifies extremists and far-right organizations as the #1 threat to US national security. This is now justifying a significant increase in national security spending, government contracts, and a rise in draconian surveillance methods. These alarmist notions are not only designed to give the military-industrial complex an updated and lucrative target, but also to deflect scrutiny away from the powerful by encouraging division among the population. Using the logic imposed by CRT, white rage as an ontological spectre is being evoked in the same way communism, jihad, and many other fearful spectres function to justify the actions of the US war machine. It is profoundly ironic that the US imperialist state apparatus, a regime that has actively encouraged and incentivized racialized justifications for killing, plundering, and exploiting non-white populations abroad, is now attempting to use the CRT framework to justify the chickens coming home to roost. The US military is also very ethnically diverse as an organization, which obviously points to the fact that attempting to racialize these issues is a clear red herring and isn't indicative of some kind of racial enlightenment within the halls of power. The marriage of CRT and the conventions of the national security state allows the elite to shamelessly imbibe the narcotic of self-righteousness, while ignoring serious inequality on class lines and redirecting hostility towards citizens that have been labeled deplorable.
Just like manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, and the notion of spreading democracy abroad, anti-racism and wokeness are fast becoming the new American false noble ideal. And it is currently being used in the same way to distract the population from the machinations of capital and the state, both domestically and abroad.
Critical race theory is, in fact, being adopted as state ideology by the liberal establishment, and part of the reason why it is so useful is because it denies scholarly interpretation and demands that it be viewed as the only intellectual frame legitimate enough to contend with its claims. This then works to purposefully undermine and mystify other forms of strategic political analysis and keeps the population at odds with each other instead of at odds with powerful interests that benefit from our collective vulnerability. It is the perfect spectre conjured up by head magicians to keep us from examining the sources of societal disparities, while wasting time and energy assigning arbitrary narratives to the outcomes of those disparities.
It's race play, fucking race play, and it's not even consensual or hot.
I mean, this form of analysis is now being taught in workplaces, where the obvious power imbalance between employer and employee is never really addressed. And it is also slowly being introduced into the school system, where children are being encouraged to see their peers through a racialized lens. A culture war backlash is beginning to emerge, both in the grassroots among concerned workers, parents, and communities, while a right-wing resurrection of the academic boogeyman of postmodern neo-Marxism is beginning to seize upon the cultural tensions. The institutional right are far better at communicating with disenfranchised Americans, and there is no institutional left to pose a strong alternative narrative, only the alarmist liberal consensus. The right wing have globbed onto the academic Marxist frame of deconstruction and how this is being retooled for the logic of CRT. However, they fail to recognize that this perversion of the Marxist frame takes the grain of truth that race is socially constructed, but then generates a racial determinism. That is the idea that outcomes in quality of life and economic access can only be completely assessed through a racialized lens. This has absolutely nothing to do with Marxist theory. In fact, it totally subverts the core tenets of Marxism. Marxism is a demystification of bourgeois ideology, and CRT and anti-racism are really just the new face of bourgeois capitalism. It is not a neo-Marxist plot, and I believe that the right gives the woke liberals and leftists too much credit in this sense. It is no accident that all the cultural demands of the so-called left always seem to work in tandem with whatever the capitalist system is already doing. It is no accident that major corporate entities, the DNC, and NGOs are behind the funding of CRT, and I don't believe that these entities are harboring a secret Marxist plot. The anti-racist industrial complex is churning out expensive diversity seminars, best-selling authors like Robin DiAngelo, and it is fast becoming a billion-dollar industry. Divide and conquer keeps us too busy to challenge anything, and white guilt prints money.
Not only does it generate a tremendous amount of profit, it also acts as the perfect disciplinary mechanism to be wielded against workers. It does this by creating the perfect moral justification for the downward mobility of members of the population who have been deemed deplorable. We don't actually have to deal with the conditions that create inequality and exploitation in workplaces, so long as that inequality and exploitation is divided equally along racial lines.
Take, for example, the 1619 Project, a long-form journalism project developed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which aims to reframe America's history by centering racial narratives as the lens to view the entire scope of American history through, using CRT deconstructionalism as the theoretical frame. Even though many of Hannah-Jones's claims are ahistorical and have been disputed by major historians, it is no coincidence that she had the support of major corporations, including Shell Oil, while paying no regard to the glaring contradictions and conflicts of interest between the struggle for genuine equality and the elite mechanisms working to give capitalism a more progressive face.
Here's a black pill for all the right-wingers who watch my channel. Critical race theory, anti-racism, and the phenomenon of wokeness cannot be fought or curtailed purely through legislative and procedural grounds. I've seen a lot of understandable right-wing pushback and calls to ban critical race theory. I have bad news for you. All of the stuff that annoys you just as much as it annoys me is wrapped up in the machinations of progressive capitalism, and the procedural front is not going to be enough to curtail any of its excesses. I believe that the only way that we can overcome these coercive trends is through shared class struggle.
There have also been subliminal calls for the right wing to wage a war against these trends on identitarian lines, and this will inevitably cause disaster. Not only because it will reify all of the premises of CRT, but also because it will end up justifying the agenda of the national security state. What we will end up seeing is two reactionary sides of the same coin, warring for ontological primacy, while the rest of us get poorer, sicker, and more exploited and atomized. Critical race theory attempts to distinguish itself from the post-civil rights mode of racial analysis by expressing open hostility towards the notion of integration and cultural pluralism, as well as a rejection of the concept of race blindness in favor of creating a world where race is given profound significance in every area of life. Proponents of CRT believe that the integration efforts of the civil rights movement were a misstep because they view the dominant white culture as inherently racist. They believe that black culture inevitably faces the threat of annihilation, or cultural genocide as they put it, and that without a conscious rejection of the dominant culture, black people risk having the cultural values and traditions that are unique to them eroded by white hegemony. Hostility towards the notion of integration evolved out of the black nationalist tradition, in which leaders like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey spoke out against integration in favor of forming race-conscious collectives that could make economic and social gains in society without being integrated into the mainstream system. It is seriously alarming that this same premise is being espoused by white nationalists, and it also encapsulates much of the same racial paranoia that has been the driving force behind radical separatism as proposed by white nationalist figures. Calls for white separatism also rely on the exact same premise that European culture faces annihilation through the integration of non-whites. Anyone who believes in equality should be incredibly skeptical about these reactionary calls to protect culture based on ascriptive racial lines without actually defining what is in need of protecting. It is also incredibly reactionary to espouse that regular people from different backgrounds interacting with one another will automatically lead to cultural genocide. It is in fact true that black culture has been exploited for profit by the capitalist hegemony. But this is true for everything in what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity. Liquid modernity is characterized by our current cultural period, in which everything is privatized and nothing can emerge within the cultural sphere without becoming part of the neoliberal order. The idea that black culture is somehow exempt from this coercive force, or that it is somehow purely racialized as a phenomena, and that it can also be blamed on integration, is deeply, deeply reactionary. As I explored previously, CRT and anti-racism are very quickly becoming hegemonic state ideology. And the more you explore the framing of white culture, the more you see that this statement is really just a stand-in for capitalist hegemony and neoliberalism, which doesn't even benefit and is even hostile towards working-class white people. Within liquid modernity, it does not matter how radical something sounds on the surface, because anything is vulnerable to become part of the void that is exploiting everything. The systemic recuperation of black culture is not the fault of integration or people being together at all. And to characterize it that way destroys any and all channels for solidarity between people from different backgrounds. The integration of this notion into the CRT framework is morally terrifying. and what I see as a reactionary backlash to the progress that has already been made to combat the residual racial essentialist ideology since the civil rights movement, disguising itself as radical. It is an obvious attempt to smuggle reactionary attitudes about race into the culture at large in the guise of progressive politics. I mean, I never thought that I would ever be at the point where I would need to argue in favor of integration in 2021, but here we are, I guess. Here are some examples of how these notions are slowly beginning to permeate the wider culture. Segregated white and black spaces were previously seen as racist, but now with BIPOC, I don't even know how that's supposed to be pronounced, but BIPOC only spaces, we are seeing this trend emerge, again using racial sensitivity as a moral justification. There has also been a cultural push of people discouraging interracial relationships and insisting that white partners will always have more power, and this is just a repackaged version of anti-miscegenation talking points. The notion of universalism and race blindness, as expressed by Martin Luther King's ethos of desiring a world where people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, is also rejected in the tenets of critical race theory. This theory stresses that white people are incapable of not being racist due to centuries of subliminal indoctrination. So therefore, attempting to coexist only forces minorities to downplay their so-called innate characteristics in order to fit into the dominant society. It is no surprise that racial essentialism is subliminally part of this claim. And ironically, that worldview is the crux of what racism actually is. The notion that minorities have immutable differences and characteristics has been the bedrock of racist ideology ever since its inception. CRT reifies a lot of the racist premises that it claims to be combating, and it is also rooted in an Afro-pessimism that sees racism as an ontological dormant evil within the unconscious of every white person. Of course, there are cultural differences between minorities and the dominant culture, but many of those differences in culture arise from the material conditions and do not automatically result in conflict. I reject the essentialist notion that immutable characteristics and differences exist between different ethnicities and cultures beyond what the material conditions generate based on economic, historical, political, and geographical factors. I reject the racial determinism that CRT is subtly reinforcing with its claims. I deeply believe in the concept of shared humanity, and I am horrified that this notion is now casually up for debate. Of course, people hold petty biases and prejudices, but prejudice and bias are extremely different from hate. Actual hatred is a very rare phenomenon because it requires a tremendous amount of dedication and effort and action to actively despise entire groups of people. The concept of race blindness has been used historically by the powers that be to dismiss genuine inequality, but the concept itself is still something we should aspire to. The ruling class and bourgeois ideology work to distort universalist concepts in a way that benefits their indifference. But that does not mean that universalism should be rejected wholesale in favor of advocating a world where the social construct of race is imbued with profound significance in a way that deters people from actually dealing with the root causes of inequality. CRT is pushing to normalize race consciousness, which basically amounts to viewing minorities through a trans-historical narrative of oppression and victimhood, and viewing the white people, regardless of their class position and historical experience, as aggressors and beneficiaries of racial conquest. Whiteness has become a shorthand for the ruling capitalist elite, and this recriminates even those white people who did not benefit directly from colonial exploitation and slavery. People are subtly being encouraged to view race with profound significance in all areas of life, both public and private, under the coercive pretense of undoing historical ills and achieving equality. But does this really achieve those ends? Or does it drive a wedge between working class people who have far more in common with each other than they do with the ruling classes? One of the primary areas of concern for most people about the rising dominance of critical race theory is the push within workplaces, education, and academia, especially on the young. The primary objective of CRT is to reconstruct a race-conscious reality through theory and foster a social reality that they can then direct operations within. Academia and education have traditionally been the grounds where CRT has had the most cultural success in attempting to overturn basic academic principles in order to establish ontological primacy. The CRT frame sets itself up in opposition to academia by declaring that the academic principles of striving for neutrality, objectivity, and attempting a balanced and measured analysis of conflicting information are merely principles that come from the white world. They are seen as inherently Eurocentric, and so if you are an academic, regardless of your skin color, you are participating in a white value system. Therefore, your academic voice is by default white. This is where the notion of political whiteness comes into play. According to this framing, Black academics who do not embrace critical race theory have lost their inherent racial identity because, according to this logic, Black scholarship and voice is inherently characterized by authenticity and therefore can never be objective. They view objectivity as an attempt to neutralize lived experience, anecdotal information, and emotional resonance, which are apparently what makes a person's voice politically Black.
Okay, let's attempt to sit here and unpick how essentializing and racist all this is before I sit here and fucking lose my mind. What an insult. What a gravely dehumanizing way to view scholarship. To insinuate that a balanced and objective academic approach is somehow inherently white, that totally nullifies and discounts the vast majority of Black scholarship and the achievements of African people.
Whiteness does not have a monopoly on Enlightenment principles, and Blackness does not have a monopoly on more subjective approaches, each of which has its place in every well-rounded academic scholar's repertoire. To limit Black scholarship to this one-dimensional distortion completely erases the great achievements of many Africans in the historical canon. The Africans who built the walls of Benin, the great mosque at Djenné, or the great classical works of art like the busts of Ife did not do so purely through vibes and authenticity, but through objective observations, mathematic calculations, and reason. Ascribing racial categories to different forms of cultural and academic exploration puts a cap on the achievements of African scholarship and the cultural production that ends up creating a bigotry of low expectations.
As someone who studied African history very intently, not today, Satan, not today.
It is no surprise that there have been pushes to lower the standards in education for Black students using this same line of reasoning. Math achievements, reading standards, and even certain forms of historical literacy are being linked to white supremacy and thrown out of the educational canon. And this will inevitably have profound impacts on the academic and scholarly achievements of Black people. It is no accident that the state is currently backing the frame of CRT because it works as the perfect moral cover to deflect from the failing and underfunded school systems and the economic precarity that many Black children face. This obviously makes education harder and less of a priority. It is easier for the state to shirk responsibility by finding moral justifications to lower the standard and compromise the literacy of vulnerable populations. This bigotry of lowered expectations is a rebranded racism being weaponized by the liberal elite. It employs a paternalism and feigned sensitivity to avoid material scrutiny and stifle the educational and economic access that vulnerable communities desperately need. Political blackness and political whiteness also gives a deeper glimpse into the agenda of CRT. Because now that race is being wielded as a cultural ontology, blackness now means adherence to this emerging bourgeois ideology that CRT represents, and whiteness is reserved for the deplorables who reject it.
It feels so good to be politically white. I'm about to go get me a small business loan.
Politically white means dissenting against this clearly reactionary ontological overhaul, no matter what race you belong to. And political blackness is reserved for an academic and activist elite who have now created a false moral avenue to hoard virtue, muscle their way into institutional access, and dismiss the economic dimensions that separate their goals from the goals of regular people. Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, is more politically black than me, and therefore deserves more of a voice. Every goddamn annoying blue checkmark white liberal is now politically black and should be prioritized over the dissenting voices of black people within the working class.
Convenient, isn't it?
In the realm of K-12 education, parents are rightly concerned about the premise of white privilege being taught to their children without nuance, and they are also concerned about their young ones being taught to view their peers through ascriptive racial categories and not just as peers, classmates, and friends. This all goes back to the desire to imbue racial identity with a profound significance espoused by proponents of CRT. Parents are outraged by what they view as the political and institutional left's desire to responsibilize children in a way that does not take into account their developing psyches and intellects. Many see this push as an arrogant imposition on the autonomy and abilities of children. In other words, children are not miniature adults, and we can't begin to expect that they fully grasp and responsibilize themselves for the tensions within an incredibly fraught adult world of politics. When it comes to white privilege, characterizing not experiencing racial discrimination as privilege sends the wrong message to children. It unconsciously teaches them that inequality is fine so long as it is distributed equally. Shifting the conversation away from inequality to notions of privilege inevitably obscures power, sources of inequality, and creates a tense environment of competition and recrimination. It divides people rather than emphasizing a sense of shared responsibility. Teaching children to reject race blindness in the way that CRT demands, teaching them to view their peers as others, and emphasizing privilege discourse will inevitably weaken the goals of solidarity and anti-racism in the long run. It will create a social reality where those ascriptive categories take primacy over basic social bonds and social development. It makes me profoundly sad, and I'd hate to see the kind of society we will enter if the goals of CRT in academia and education are actually accomplished. It will not only be a profound tragedy for young white children, it will be an even more profound tragedy for young black children as well.
I'm in an interracial relationship, and I do hope to have children one day. But it frightens me to think about how this could affect my child's view of their academic achievement, the way they view their peers, the way they may view their own racial mix. It's really, really frightening stuff.
Critical race theory deceptively frames itself as a profound rejection of the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment reasoning, and the neutral principles of constitutional law.
As a person whose worldview is informed by Marxism, I don't view the liberal framework or Enlightenment principles to be false in their intentionality, but I see them as false in their contradictions.
Karl Marx was one of the primary critics of liberalism, but only in the sense that liberalism failed to live up to the values of freedom and enlightenment, and he saw the fight for a fair economic system as the only way to bring about those ideals. Marx saw the primary contradiction of bourgeois liberalism, the ideological force behind industrial capitalism, was that it promised freedoms that it failed to deliver. Marxism was not an attack on the stated goals of liberalism, but rather an attack on the contradictions within bourgeois liberal society and the systems and frameworks it generates to make the noble ideals of liberalism impossible to achieve. On the other hand, critical race theory is a full-on assault on the stated goals themselves, as well as the class solidarity that the left is supposed to stand for. If anything, critical race theory is a reactionary force because it proposes a return to a racially segregated and thus anti-universalist political framework. It insists that race is the primary political construction. So, liberal foundations such as equal treatment and protection under constitutional law and freedom of speech must be limited or even discarded in the name of racial justice. People are rightly skeptical of eroding and casting to the wind the rights we already have within bourgeois society, i.e. constitutional law, freedom of speech, etc., in favor of allowing a racialized understanding to claim ontological primacy. It is a full-fledged assault on the principles of the liberal order without even attempting to propose solutions beyond racialized narrative building. What makes CRT so dubious is its lack of vision and clearly stated goals. What would it actually change about society if CRT's demands were met? The fundamental contradiction of class struggle and antagonisms would still remain even if CRT became the norm in every American institution. It is very dubiously unclear what this institutional push actually desires for society, criminal justice, law, etc. And people are rightly skeptical about any such imposed overhaul of society, no matter what political direction it emerges from. The liberal framework of equity and universality is not false in its intentionality, only false in its contradictions. The principles are still things we should fight for and not allow them to be bullied away from us by the acceleration of bourgeois ideology. The evil in the world almost always comes from ignorance, and good intentions do as much harm as malevolence if they lack understanding. On the whole, men are more good than bad. That, however, isn't the point. The soul of the murderer is blind, and there can be no true goodness nor true love without the utmost clear-sightedness. Albert Camus. American political theorist Hannah Arendt coined the term the banality of evil while studying the 1961 trial of Adolph Eichmann, a Nazi operative responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of Jewish people and other marked out groups during the Nazi final solution. Arendt was taken aback by Eichmann's terrifyingly normal disposition and the mundane nature of his overall character. She eventually concluded that the banality of evil is characterized by ideological forces, dogma, propaganda, blind obedience, and the proliferation of cliches and stereotypes about perceived outgroups, and a tendency towards self-victimization. Arendt believed that all of these factors contribute to the normalization of evil, and even the most mundane person is capable of carrying out evil deeds and fostering malevolent hatred.
It scares me that we have forgotten this. It frightens me that we are once again compelled to repeat the mistakes of history by viewing evil as a purely ontological outside force instead of something that every human being has to contend with inside their own heart. Human history has always been rife with tensions and injustices, but we do not reckon with history by trying to erase it. We reckon with it by attempting to make the present better. I'm sorry to be the one to break it to you, but the racial narrative will never ever find healing until we stop demonizing each other and start realizing that every single human heart on this planet, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, has the capacity for both great good and great evil within it. This is why the universalist ethos within shared class struggle is so important, and why dividing the poor and working class along racial lines only serves to empower reactionary movements. It only creates room for the far right and the liberal left to seize more ontological ground.
It is the beauty of togetherness, new forms of culture, new forms of love, and new forms of understanding that will help us heal racism, not academic theory. This should be a no-brainer, right? I'm afraid not, because right now as we speak, the ruling class are waging an assault on everything we hold dear and everything that we have collectively fought for leading up to this moment in history. There is no race, there is no category that should separate us enough so that we forget all the profound significance of all the things that we hold in common.
How dare the elites look down on us and tell us that virtue trickles down? How dare they posture as moral authorities when they are the ones who benefit from the spoils of our division? Anti-racism cannot be implemented from top down. It is fundamentally grassroots, and it begins in our communities, in our households, and most importantly, in our hearts. Proponents of critical race theory are trying to convince us all that we are too dull-witted to understand what they are doing or what they're even arguing for. And in recent years, the liberal left has made some incredibly draconian moves to silence dissent from Marxists, especially Black Marxists, like Adolph Rhyd and Barbara Fields and so on. They treat us as if we are incapable of reasoning or parsing through this information ourselves. It just shows a massive contempt for our intelligence because we are being told to distrust other working class people, yet trust the elites and their bourgeois ideology, because the higher ups always know best, you see. I am a Black content creator, and my worldview is largely informed by Marxism. I also hold very heterodox positions on much of the dogma that emerges from the liberal left. Because of this, I am constantly subtly incentivized to hide my true feelings and convictions, put on the dominatrix costume, and performatively scold white liberals about how naughty they are so that they can feel good about themselves and feel like they're helping and feel like they're contributing by amplifying my voice. I guess that's just my stumbling block. The fact that I'm not really willing to betray my principles or my authenticity in order to become part of the Black liberal elite. It's never really appealed to me. But in this world of CRT and anti-racism, as a Black person, it's what you're told you have to do in order to have a voice. You have to make yourself into a one-dimensional caricature. You have to do the kayfabe. You have to put on the dominatrix outfit. And as much as I like this outfit, it's kind of uncomfortable and impractical. I like to be comfortable. I like to be myself. I don't want to prioritize race over friendships and genuine affinity. My people are not the people who look like me. My people are the people in my community. My people are the people that I love. My people are the people that I share goals and values with. I refuse to let anyone else tell me otherwise. And so should you. We're all in this together. And I truly, truly in my marrow believe that. And I don't think I'll ever stop believing that. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I really hope that it gave you some food for thought. I'm sorry again that this video is a little late. You know me, once I choose a subject, I need to do like a really huge like deep dive into it. And this was originally supposed to be a shorter video, but then it kind of ran away with itself and got really long. Here's another offering on the channel, and I'm also currently simultaneously working on another video. So there'll be another one out soon as well about another very interesting topic. If you like this video and you like my channel and you want to help me make more content at more frequent rates, I have a Patreon that you can help donate to in order to help the channel along. I always appreciate it. Every little donation helps at any size. Anything's welcome. I have a Discord server. I also try to do monthly live streams for patrons as well. I also do tarot rewards. So if you would like to support the channel, I urge that you have a look at my Patreon and help support me there. I also have some really cool tarot themed merch. So if you would like to help support the channel in a more one-off way, then you can support the channel by taking a look at my merchandise. All links are in the description. And don't despair that it sort of takes me a little bit longer to make the videos. If you really like hearing from me, I also do a podcast with my partner called Low Society. You can check us out. We're on all the major podcast platforms. We've also had some really cool guests on recently, including Anna Kachian from Red Scare. So if you would like to check out Low Society podcast, that's there. And I do episodes weekly, so you can find me weekly there. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you soon with something fresh. See you later.